In 1970, a 70-year-old man with a bad heart boarded a plane in Miami. He wasn't running from a rival gang, and he wasn't running from a bullet. He was running from an audit. For 50 years, Meyer Lansky had been the quiet architect standing behind America's most violent criminal organizations. Never the man who pulled the trigger, always the man who made the money disappear and reappear, clean. Federal investigators would spend decades and millions of dollars trying to prove he had hundreds of millions of dollars hidden across a chain of banks that spanned 3 continents. They arrested him. They indicted him. They followed him to Switzerland, to the Bahamas, to Israel. They never got the money. So how does a man with a 4th-grade education, who never fired a gun in his adult life, become the single-figure historians credit with turning organized crime from a street-level protection racket into a global financial enterprise? And where, exactly, did the money go? His name was Meyer Lansky, though it wasn't the name he was born with. To the press, he was the mob's accountant. To law enforcement, he was one of the most dangerous men in America, not because of what he did with a gun, but because of what he did with a ledger. Lansky mattered because he solved a problem that had bankrupted or exposed nearly every major criminal organization before him. What do you do with millions of dollars that can never be explained to a tax collector? Al Capone went to prison not for murder, but for failing to answer that question. Lansky spent his life answering it, and in doing so, he built the financial infrastructure that organized crime would rely on for the rest of the 20th century. This is the story of the man historians and investigators alike have called the father of modern money laundering, how he built it, how far it reached, and why, in the end, the government could never quite prove what everyone believed to be true.
Meyer Lansky was born Meyer Sucholjansky in 1902 in Grodno, then part of the Russian Empire, today part of Belarus. His family were Jewish immigrants fleeing the poverty and anti-Semitic violence common across the Russian Pale of Settlement. And in 1911, they crossed the Atlantic and settled on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. The Lower East Side in the 1910s was one of the most densely packed immigrant neighborhoods in the world, a place where a smart, undersized kid with no money and no connections had exactly 2 paths forward: work himself into the ground in a factory, or find another way. Lansky found the other way early. As a teenager, he began running dice games on the street corners of his neighborhood, and it was here he met a slightly younger, far more volatile partner, Benjamin Siegel, later known to the world as Bugsy. The pairing worked because it was a study in contrasts. Siegel was explosive, charismatic, and quick to violence. Lansky was calm, careful, and even as a teenager, obsessed with numbers. Together, they moved from dice games into auto theft, then into helping bootleggers disguise their vehicles during Prohibition, then into bootlegging itself. It was the 1920s liquor trade, historians widely agree, that gave Lansky his real education, not in violence but in logistics, distribution networks, and, critically, how to move large sums of illegal cash through a financial system never designed to notice it. By his early 20s, Lansky wasn't just a criminal. He was becoming something rarer, a criminal who understood finance better than most bankers. The alliance that would define Lansky's career began in the late 1920s with a rising Sicilian gangster named Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Where older mafia bosses clung to strict ethnic loyalty, Italians only, no outsiders, Luciano and Lansky both understood something the old guard didn't. Crime was becoming a business, and business rewards competence over bloodline. In 1931, according to multiple historical accounts, Lansky played a role in persuading Luciano that boss Giuseppe, Joe the Boss, Masseria needed to be removed to end a bloody gang war. Masseria was killed that same year. What followed was not simply a changing of the guard, it was a restructuring. Between 1932 and 1934, Lansky joined Luciano, Johnny Torrio, and Albert Anastasia in forming what would become known as the National Crime Syndicate. a loose commission binding together Italian and Jewish criminal organizations that had previously operated as rivals. Lansky's role in this new structure was singular. He was not a boss in the traditional sense. He commanded no army of soldiers and controlled no single territory. Instead, he became the syndicate's banker and financial overseer, the man other bosses trusted to manage, invest, and most importantly, launder the enormous cash flows generated by bootlegging, gambling, and racketeering. It was a position of enormous power precisely because it was invisible. Muscle could be replaced. A man who understood how to make millions of dollars vanish from law enforcement's view could not. Through the 1930s, Lansky expanded his gambling operations from New York into New Jersey, then south into Florida, and beyond U.S. borders entirely into Cuba. Each new territory wasn't just a new revenue stream. It was a new jurisdiction, a new legal gray zone, another layer he could use to separate dirty money from its criminal origin. By the 1940s and into the 1950s, Meyer Lansky was operating at a scale few criminals in American history had ever reached. His gambling interests stretched across Florida's carpet joints, illegal casinos disguised behind legitimate-looking storefronts, into the emerging Las Vegas Strip, and most spectacularly, into Havana. Cuba, under the government of Fulgencio Batista, became something close to a personal playground for Lansky's ambitions. He didn't just run casinos there. He helped design the entire tourist gambling economy of the island, developing luxury hotel casinos like the Riviera and investing in others, including the famed Tropicana. American tourists flew in by the plane load, drawn by glamour, sunshine, and games of chance, never suspecting that the elegant casino floor beneath them was also a laundering machine, a place where illegal cash could be converted into winnings, loans, and legitimate-looking hotel revenue. Lansky's genius, according to financial crime historians, wasn't any single trick. It was layering, moving money through multiple shell corporations and fronts, until the original criminal source became untraceable, then having those offshore entities lend the clean money back to legitimate-looking American businesses, sometimes even collecting tax-deductible interest on the loans. Cash moved by courier, sometimes literally in suitcases, first around the country, and eventually toward Swiss banks, whose strict secrecy laws, passed in the 1930s, made them a preferred destination for exactly this kind of money. At his estimated peak, Lansky's personal fortune was rumored, and it must be stressed this figure is disputed and difficult to verify, to approach $300 million, tucked away, reporters claimed, in accounts law enforcement could never fully trace. Whether that number was accurate or exaggerated mob legend has never been definitively settled. What isn't disputed is the company Lansky kept and the world he inhabited. Casino floors filled with celebrities, a friendship network that included some of the most powerful organized crime figures in the country, and a lifestyle of understated, deliberately unflashy wealth. Because flash, Lansky believed, was what got other men caught. Empires built on secrecy carry the seeds of their own exposure, and Lansky's began to crack from several directions at once. The first crack came from Cuba itself. In 1959, Fidel Castro's revolution swept through the island, and the new government moved to nationalize American-owned casinos and hotels, including Lansky's prized Riviera. Overnight, one of the most lucrative pieces of his empire was simply gone, seized by a government he had no leverage over. It was a lesson in the limits of even the most carefully built criminal enterprise. Political upheaval didn't care about ledgers. The second and far more dangerous crack came from Washington. Through the 1950s and 1960s, congressional investigations, most famously the Kefauver hearings, had begun mapping the outlines of organized crime's national structure for the first time, and Lansky's name kept surfacing at the center of it. The IRS, unable to make racketeering or violence charges stick to a man who never touched a weapon, shifted its focus to the one thing it might actually be able to prove: tax evasion, the same charge that had finally taken down Al Capone decades earlier. By 1970, federal investigators believed they finally had enough to move against Lansky directly, targeting his alleged use of a Swiss bank to hide untaxed income. Warned, according to most accounts, that an indictment was coming, Lansky did something almost no major organized crime figure of his era had done. He left the country entirely, flying to Israel and attempting to claim citizenship under that nation's law of return. Israel refused him. After nearly 2 years of legal battles and mounting political pressure, some of it from the United States government itself, Israel's Supreme Court denied Lansky's citizenship claim in 1972, and he was deported back to the United States to face the charges he had fled. What followed defied the expectations of nearly everyone watching. Prosecutors indicted Lansky on charges including tax evasion and conspiracy. But building a criminal case against a man who had spent 50 years perfecting the art of leaving no trace proved to be extraordinarily difficult. Witnesses were reluctant. Financial records were layered through so many shell companies and foreign jurisdictions that prosecutors struggled to draw a clean line from casino skim to Lansky's own pocket. By the mid-1970s, citing his declining health and the weakness of the evidence, courts acquitted him or saw charges dropped entirely. It was, in a strange way, the final proof of everything Lansky had built his life around. The government could describe his empire in exhaustive detail: congressional testimony, FBI surveillance files, and journalist investigations painted a consistent picture of a man who had laundered fortunes for organized crime for half a century. What they could never do was make it hold up in a courtroom. Lansky spent his final years in Miami Beach, living, by most accounts, a modest and unremarkable retirement, a stark, almost eerie contrast to the hundreds of millions of dollars he was rumored to control. He died of lung cancer in January 1983, at 80 years old, never having spent a single day in prison for the financial empire that made him infamous. Meyer Lansky never invented money laundering. People have hidden the origins of dirty money for as long as there has been money to hide. But historians and financial crime investigators consistently credit him with something more specific and more consequential. He industrialized it. He took a patchwork of amateur tricks and turned them into a repeatable system: shell corporations, offshore secrecy jurisdictions, cash courier networks, and legitimate-looking front businesses working together as a single integrated machine. That system didn't disappear when he died. Variations of it are still the backbone of financial crime investigations conducted by agencies around the world today. His story also marked a turning point in how organized crime itself was policed. The failure to convict him on the financial charges that mattered most helped drive the eventual expansion of anti-money laundering law in the United States, including bank reporting requirements designed specifically to make the kind of layered, cross-border cash movement Lansky pioneered harder to hide. There's a version of this story that plays like a cautionary tale about greed and violence, but Lansky's story is something colder and, in some ways, more unsettling, proof that the most dangerous man in a room isn't always the one with the gun. Sometimes it's the quiet one, doing the math in the corner, and by the time anyone realizes what he's built, it's already too late to take it apart.